with the UN Security Council Resolution 191 and the General Assembly Resolution, the UN General Assembly, not a Security Council, sorry, General Assembly Resolution, which partitioned the land of Palestine into an independent Israeli state and a Palestinian state. However, the Arab states of Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, the bordering states of Israel today, were unwilling to accept and recognize the state of Israel, calling it a colonial entity, and therefore declared a war against Israel, the newly established state of Israel. This led to a war, a full-fledged war breaking out between Israel and the Arab states, and Israel had succeeded in dispelling and expelling most of the Palestinians who lived in the state of Israel that was set up. So that is how the state of Israel was established in 1948. So the Arab states, this was the first instance. This from 1948 begins the confrontation that Israel has with the Arab states. So the Palestinians who were expelled from their territory and who were forced to leave and vacate their villages for the state of Israel to be established took refuge in mostly the Gaza Strip as well as the West Bank. And in West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they lived as refugees for years, till even today they are staying as refugees in their own land, in West Bank as well as the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip, the condition is slightly different, which I will tell you in a moment. So this was 1948. So this day on which Israel expels the Palestinians from their homeland, the Palestinians call it their homeland, is called as the Nakba by the Palestinians, and the state of Israel and the Jews call it as a war of independence. And for the Jews, it is a war of independence. For the Palestinians, it is a day of shame. So therefore, they call it Nakba. So this led to the question of Palestinian refugees, Palestinians without a state, which is also in a way supported by the Arab states, saying that this will lead to, eventually, we will completely eliminate and defeat the state of Israel and the Western powers which actually aided the state of Israel to be set up in this land. And therefore, they refuse to recognize Israel. So this continues, and then again there is a major war that breaks out, that is in 67, which is called as a 6-day war. So in the 6-day war, when Arab countries again declare a war against Israel, Israel manages to capture territories from few of the Arab states. Egypt, the Israeli army captures from Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula. They capture the West Bank and from Transjordan. This was a territory which was managed by Transjordan then. Now today it is the Republic of Jordan. Then it was the Transjordan. And then they also capture Golan Heights from Syria. So these are the territories that Israel manages to capture from the Arab states. And Israel occupies them. Not just occupies them, after 67, that is after the 6-day war, the government of Israel and the Jews, who are in a very triumphalistic mode, also start sponsoring what they call as settlements. What are these settlements? Israel was always in need for more land. The land that was allocated to them, according to the UN partition plan of 191, was never sufficient for the Israelis, because there are more and more Jews who joined, who were waiting to get citizenship from the state of Israel, when the state of Israel is established in 1948. By the 1960s, they have more number of Jews coming in from mostly the Arab states. Why only after the 60s or why only after the 50s? The state of Israel established in 1948 was established, or the movement, the Zionist movement, which started in the 19th century, was about seeking a safe haven for the Jews living in Eastern Europe, that is Germany and the other countries of Western Europe. Most of the educated Jews settled down in America, the United States of America. Some of them fled to Britain, where they occupied important political positions. They took up important jobs. Mostly in America, we have very important, capitalist bankers. They were doing quite well in America and in America and Great Britain. But the same was not the case with most of them who remained in Western Europe. That is, most of these countries which came under the German occupation, the Nazi occupation, and therefore most of the Jews living there, they supported the Zionist movement. And then the Second World War and the Holocaust during the Second World War hastened the Zionist movement and elicited the support of the Western states, so that the Western states also started supporting the state of Israel to be established as a safe haven for the Jews who fled Western Europe. And that is how the state of Israel was established. But then by 1948, when the state of Israel is established in the Middle East and it displaces a huge number of Arab population, I'm saying Arab because that is how the Palestinians were called till 1993. They were referred to as the Arabs who lived in that land, who were living in that land. There were Arabs living in that land who were displaced because the state of Israel was established. And this led to widespread anti-Israeli sentiments across the Middle East. And we should always remember that anti-Semitism was a phenomenon in the Western European states. It was never a phenomenon in the Middle East, even when Jews had lived there in almost every other state, Yemen, Iraq. We have Baghdadi Jews, the Tehrani Jews who lived in Iran. There were Jews who lived in Ethiopia. So all of these all of these Jewish communities hardly faced any anti-Semitism. But then because of the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jews in increasing numbers started facing anti-Semitic attacks. And some of the states like Iran much later after the Islamic Revolution. But then the other states, like Syria, the Arab states, mostly the Arab states, they introduced legislations which stripped the Jews of their citizenship, not just Jews of their citizenship, but also forced them or expelled them from the countries in which they were residing. And this led to so many of the Jews who are referred to today as the Sephardic Jews. So the Sephardic Jews had to leave. The Eastern European Jews are referred to as the Ashkenazi. So the Ashkenazi Jews were already in residence. They were already established in the state of Israel, in the newly set up state of Israel. There are also Sephardic Jews who are now leaving Israel leaving the other countries and joining and coming to the state of Israel. So obviously this meant that Israel wanted more and more territory. By the 1990s, there is another major development that happens in Europe, and that is the dismemberment or the what is called as the dismantlement of the Soviet Union. Because of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Jews living in all of these states, they are let go by Stalin. Never let them go. He made rules that it made impossible for the Jews to leave Soviet Union. But now that the Soviet Union was no longer a state, no longer an entity, a powerful entity, so many of these Jews could make their journey towards the state of Israel. So this led to a demand for more and more land by Israel, more resources to settle down Jews. At the same time, we should also understand that by 1967, there was another movement that was simultaneously happening in Israel, and that is called as a settler movement. So the Jewish state started aiding settlements in the occupied territories, the territories that they have occupied from Egypt, Syria, Transjordan. In all of these territories, the Israelis started setting up, or the state started sponsoring what is called as settlements. And in these settlements, there were Jews who belonged to the right wing, who were indoctrinated to such an extent. And then there are a group of Jews who are called as the Messianic Jews, who feel that the land of Israel in its entirety, from the land of, from Jordan till the northern part of Israel, it belongs to them. And it is their ancestral land. And therefore, they are legally, they can take over this land for themselves. So this is one movement that started within Israel. And because it was a Labour Party which was in power, the Labour in power in Israel for a long time, till almost 1970s, 1977, these settlements were also aided, but then this movement was not as powerful as it is today. But today we have the same settlers attacking the Palestinians. We have the settlers attacking Palestinian communities in the West Bank after the attack on Gaza, after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. So this is how the settler movement began. So Israel was in need for more land. There is also a settler movement that is happening within Israel. Alongside, there are also talks. There are also movements. There are also peace movements aided by the American state. These states were pushing for a peace, a settlement to be established with Israel. However, there was no peace until Israel finally, Egypt is the first Arab state to decide that they would want to have peace negotiations with Israel. So this came with a couple of strings attached for Egypt and for the other Arab states. The other Arab states obviously were not happy with this, with Egypt wanting to sign a peace agreement with Israel. Therefore, Egypt was expelled. They were thrown out of the Arab League. Arab League is a powerful group of Arab states. Around 22 Arab states joined together to form the Arab League, and Egypt is expelled. And the most powerful member, as we all know, Egypt is also one of the members of the anti-colonial front that was set up by, along with Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, Nasser, as well as the Yugoslavian president Tito. So this front was also, Egypt was also a very active member of the Arab League and was also a leader of the Arab League. So they are thrown out of the Arab League, and this marks the end of Arab socialism as well as Arab nationalism. So from then on, from 67 onwards, Egypt is the first state to recognize the state of Israel, and in negotiations that happened, they are willing to negotiate, not just negotiate with Israel, but also they are willing to sit across the table and recognize the state of Israel. The Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, he addresses the Knesset, and then he's invited by the Knesset. He addresses the Knesset, and this makes frontline news across the world. The Arab countries are so dismayed. Most of them feel that it is a kind of a traitorous act by Anwar Sadat, by the Egyptian government, and this leads to Egypt being expelled. Not just that, not just Egypt being expelled. This also leads to the other Arab states taking up the cause of Palestinians on the one hand. At the same time, the Palestinians also realize now that since a very important member of the Arab League, Egypt, had already signed a peace agreement with Israel, now it is time for them to stand up for themselves and fight. So by 1979, there is another important development that happens in the region, and that is the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So the Islamic Revolution in Iran completely changes the geopolitics that happens in the region, because of which Iran becomes the first country which invites the Palestinian president, that is the PLO president, Palestinian PLO president, because there was no Palestinian president as such. There was, because PLO is recognized as the was a militant organization then in 1979. That is before they signed a peace treaty with Israel. So then he is invited as a state guest. He's provided full honors, and he meets the Islamic revolutionaries in Iran who have just newly come to power, newly established state of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So these are a couple of developments that happen. Meanwhile, the other states are also willing to negotiate. The Arab states are also willing to negotiate with Israel in order to get their territory back. So Jordan has an arrangement with Israel, recognizes Israel. This was in 1994. Syria is also willing to have negotiations. So these are a couple of developments that happens in quick succession. And all of this was a setback to the Palestinians. So by the 1990s, the Palestinians also decide that they are now willing to accept and recognize the state of Israel, provided there are negotiations on issues of settlements, there is a two-state solution, there is talks for peace, they can exchange land for peace. So all of these settlements come into effect, and then they also they are willing to recognize the state of Israel. This finally leads to what we call as the Oslo Agreement of 1993. So since 1993, PLO is recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO is in negotiations with Israel for land. The other Arab states, which have already recognized Israel, are also supporting this. So Palestinians have been negotiating. The PLO has been in negotiations with the state of Israel since then. So this continued for a while. And then there are also a couple of tensions that happened between the Israelis and the Palestinians. One is what we call as the Intifada in 1987. There is the first Intifada that happens in 1987. This was in occupied territories. So that is why we call them OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories. So in occupied Palestinian territories, there is an Intifada in 1987. Since 1987, after the first Intifada, there are peace talks. They recognize the state of Israel. There are a couple of arrangements that are effected between the Palestinians and the Israelis, especially with regard to territories. Settlements is an issue that will be discussed and debated. And Israelis were always willing to completely withdraw from the settlements, provided there is an agreement. This was the deal initially. So the negotiations continue for a while. And then in 2003, again there is an Intifada in 2000. So after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the other Arab Middle Eastern states, that is states like Saudi Arabia, states like Qatar, states like UAE, most of these states also fear Iran, the ascent of Iran in the region, and the Islamism and the Islamic revolution, which they dread, can also take place in their respective states. And therefore, they make every effort to export the Islamic ideology. So this is a state-funded project. They also fund states who they also send their missionaries. Wahhabi missionaries are being sent. So this, in a way, indoctrinates the Muslim populations living in much poorer states like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, even in India, some poorer regions. So all of these developments happen after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and this is also a state-sponsored project. So alongside, now the Israelis have to have a double challenge. One is how to deal with the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The other is how do we actually control this rising wave, a rising tide of Islamism that was engulfing the region. So this is the two-front challenge that they face. At the same time, after the 1993, when a peace deal is signed between the Palestinians and the Israelis, there is a right-wing movement that also takes shape within Iran, and this is among the settler communities. And one of them assassinates President Rabin of Israel, who was instrumental in signing this peace agreement. And in Egypt, Anwar Sadat is again assassinated by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, because that member is unhappy with the peace deal that Egypt had with Israel. So this period, though there are peace deals between Arab states and the Palestinians, there is also a right-wing movement, not just in the Arab states, not just in the Palestinian territories, but also in Israel, within Israel. So we should also note this fact that there is an emergence of right-wing movements which completely disavow peace in the region that is happening since the 1990s. And then come 2000s, there is again a second Intifada, and this was completely Islamicized. The region was completely Islamicized by this time. There is the spark that was lit was by Ariel Sharon and his generals. Ariel Sharon was a general then. He walked into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a very holy mosque in the tradition of the Muslims. He walks with his boots on inside the mosque, after which there are riots which break out between the Palestinians, mostly Muslims, and the Israelis, the Jews. So this has been continuing for a while. So how did Hamas emerge? Hamas emerged as a force much before, when the Palestinians were willing to negotiate, when PLO was willing to negotiate with the Israelis for a land for peace settlement. They were willing to recognize the state of Israel. It is then that Hamas emerges. And Hamas is an Islamic jihad, Islamic fundamentalist movement in the occupied Palestinian territories, who say in their charter that they call for the complete destruction of the state of Israel. They are not for negotiations with Israel. they will in no way negotiate with the state of Israel. So this is the position of Hamas, and they have been so since 1987, since the time Hamas has been established. So in 2003, there was a major development. Ariel Sharon, when he was a prime minister, 2005, sorry. In 2005, Ariel Sharon completely disengages from Gaza. What is the meaning of disengaging from an occupied territory? I told you about the settlements that were set up in the occupied Palestinian territories of West Bank as well as the Gaza Strip. This is also an occupied Palestinian territory. So from this, the settlers were completely withdrawn. The settlers were completely withdrawn, and there were elections that were held in Gaza Strip. And in the elections that were held, the PLO does not win the elections. It is Hamas that wins the elections. So this was a challenge in a way for the government of Israel as well as the United States, because the United States has been talking about a democratization project which was taken up by the administration of George W. Bush. And here you have, because of democratization, an Islamic fundamentalist group which finds favor with the people, and they win the elections, and they come to power in the Gaza Strip. So since then there have been no elections. Since then we don't know what is the pulse, what do the Palestinians feel about Hamas? But then Hamas has been able to provide them, the Palestinians, with charity services, with hospital services, schools. They run schools, they have Islamic charities. Most of the money comes from not just Saudi Arabia, it also comes from Iran and other states. And they are also militarily supported by the Hezbollah as well as by Iran. So this is, the region is clearly divided now between Iran-supported movements, Iran-supported non-state actors, and then on the other hand is Israel and its supporters. Saudi Arabia, UAE, these are countries which support Israel. And the reason they support Israel is not just because of the Palestinians. Palestinian issue has always remained an issue since 1967. This is not the reason. The reason why they support Israel is because of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So since the revolution, the Arab states, mostly the Arab states which have monarchies, which feared an Islamic revolution of a similar kind can occur in their respective societies, started challenging Iran. Iran's nuclear program, Iran's taking up this nuclear weapons program. So all of this is perceived to be a challenge by the Arab states. And they feel that they would need the support of Israel to tackle the threat from Iran. And therefore, recently there was an agreement that was signed between what is called as the Abraham Accords. This was an agreement that was effected between a few Arab states, the UAE, Sudan, and two other states, and Israel. And by this agreement, they would recognize the state of Israel, which they haven't. And there are also ongoing talks with Saudi Arabia to recognize the state of Israel and also calling for a settlement with the Palestinians. At the same time, Israel, instead of having all kinds of negotiations, that is including with the Palestinians on a same scale, refused to negotiate with the Palestinians, calling the PLO corrupt, calling the PLO inefficient, and this in a way strengthened the hands of Hamas. So they have actually strengthened Hamas at the expense of the Palestinians. So Israelis, when they signed the deal with the Arab states like Sudan and UAE, they felt that it was no longer necessary for them to negotiate with the Palestinians or with the PLO, because they are anyway signing accords with the other Arab states. The other Arab states are willing to recognize them. And therefore, there was also, in a way, responsible. The Israeli government has been in a way responsible to strengthen the Hamas, the organization called Hamas, which refuses to negotiate. The PLO is willing to negotiate. The Israelis are the ones who have completely frozen the peace process since 2017. And then after which they signed the Abraham Accords with the other Arab states. So these are a couple of developments that have strengthened the hands of the Hamas. So now let me just tell you in 5 minutes, what are the issues that the Palestinians face within the occupied territories. The major issue that they face, so Gaza Strip is a completely disengaged territory by the Israelis. They don't have any engagement with the Gaza Strip. However, they still control electricity, they still control internet, they still control foreign affairs, they still control the defense, because they feel that defense is something that should be managed completely by the Israeli state. But then it is an independent territory, which more or less autonomy, etc., which is being provided by the Hamas, which claims itself to be a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip, not in the West Bank. So in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, especially in the West Bank, you have the Palestinians face numerous challenges. One major challenge that they face is what they call as security checkpoints. What are these security checkpoints? These security checkpoints are manned by the Israelis, the Israeli police, the Israeli security agency, which is Shin Bet. So this is a security agency that manages the checkpoints. What do they do in the checkpoints? So the Palestinians don't have a free entry. They cannot have free entry and they cannot have freedom of passage. They cannot freely move between the territories, even within Palestinian territories, because the Israelis have put checkpoints almost in every other town. And this makes the life of the Palestinians so very difficult. The life of the Palestinians are so very difficult in the sense that because of the security checkpoints, it is very difficult for them to, in case they have to go for weddings, or if there is a wedding that is happening, the bride would be from a particular town. Say, for example, the bride is from Ramallah. If the bridegroom is from Jenin, so obviously they'll have to travel for quite some time within West Bank. But then because of the checkpoints, they can be held just for an interrogation by the security forces, Israeli security forces, and they can be held for any number of hours. So sometimes their father can be held, sometimes their brother can be held, sometimes the bridegroom himself can be held, and this has happened. And you have children waiting inside the car for hours together. Obviously, children get very restless. So these are some of the things that really make life difficult for the Palestinians. So this is one. The other major issue that the Palestinians face within the West Bank is settler violence. I told you about the settlers. Who are these settlers? That is Jewish people who have been settled and sponsored, funded by the state of Israel, building apartments in the occupied territories. And this region, this settlements, the area where the settlements will be is classified as Area C, which means that there will be the military law is applicable for the Palestinians living in Area A and B. But in Area C, where the settlers live, the Jewish settlers live in the Palestinian territories, military law is not applicable. Israeli military law is not applicable. They will be, for them, for the Israelis, it will be the Israeli civilian law. So you have settler violence tackled according to the Israeli civilian law. And the Palestinians' normal lives, Palestinians' normal movement from one city to another city within the West Bank will be guided by Israeli military law. And therefore, anyone can be held indefinitely for any amount of time. So this is exactly what is leading to a lot of unrest, unhappiness, disillusionment with Israeli rule in the occupied territories, right? So most of the Palestinians are really fed up with Israeli occupation, not just with Israeli occupation, all the checkpoints, etc., but also with the settler violence. So now we have, yesterday there was a news that there is a spike in the settler violence in the West Bank. We all know that Israel is preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza. So most of the Gaza, people living in the Gaza, almost everybody has been shifted to the border with Egypt, near the Rafah crossing, where there is humanitarian aid coming from, internationally arranged humanitarian aid, which is coming through the Rafah crossing, that is the southern border of Israel. But now you have the Palestinians living in the West Bank who have to face not just this the sentiment which is against them and not just making life difficult for the Palestinians, but also almost every day they are facing what is called a settler violence. The settlers get into tension, get into arguments, get into scuffle with the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And the West settlers, even if they indulge in violence, will be judged in the Israeli civilian law, in the Israeli civilian courts. And the Palestinians, when they respond to these settlers, would be judged by the Israeli military law. And this is something which is very unfair. So this is one of the reasons why there is so much of anti-Israeli, anti-occupation protests that happens almost every other day. The other important issue is the number of Palestinians held in detention in Israeli jails, in the jails in Israel, and also in jails in West Bank. And we have always heard about, for the past couple of years, we have heard about lots of Palestinians who are held in detention, protesting, fasting, hunger strikes. We have heard about this. There are reports published by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so many other organizations. But what is important at this point is that most of the, just before this violence between, just before this attack by the Hamas on Israel happened, 2 days before or one day before, there was a Palestinian who was languishing in the Israeli jail, and he was held under, his name is Adnan, and he was held under administrative detention. So they have two kinds of detention. The Palestinians are suffering two kinds of detention. One is administrative detention, the other one is the normal detention, that is, they might be serving a prison sentence, or they might be held by the Israeli army, they might be held by the Israeli military for questioning. This is one form of detention. Administrative detention is that they can be held indefinitely for any amount of time with a 6 months extension without being on trial. So there are so many Palestinians on charges or just being suspect can be held in Israeli jails for an indefinite period of time. So Adnan is one such person who was held under detention for, he has served almost 7 years in jail. And he died. He was protesting he was on a hunger strike. 92 days, 92nd day he collapses in his room. Usually the Israeli government, the Israeli military authorities treat these people when they are on hunger strikes because they are forcefully fed. But in his case, there was no forceful feeding, they let him die. And it is alleged that they let him die in the prison. So this led to protests. Everything was boiling under the surface, right? And then finally, this happens, Hamas attack on Israel. And the Hamas had also made a statement just the day before saying that we will avenge the blood of Adnan. This is the statement that they have made just before the day of the attack, that is October 9th attack. So I think I'll stop here, and then if you have questions, we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am, for giving us such an insightful lecture. It's really impressive. You are talked about from the basics of the Zionist movement and how the Israel was formed in 1948. Further, you told about how Jews were the exploit and the role of Oslo movement, Nakba, and the relations with Egypt, and later the occupied Palestinian territories. And later you said about the Rabin assassination and Anwar Sadat assassination in Egypt. Later you talks about the future aspects and the current challenges out the security checkpoint are be pointed in the Gaza strips, and how Israelis were told it to be Palestinians and to follow the security checkpoints and their points. And you all lastly talk about administrative detention for the Palestinians. It is the new point we didn't know about. The administrative detention is follow up in the Israel, and how the Palestinians were caught under this particular clause in the administrative detention. It's a really insightful lectures. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Now I wish all of you to ask questions. If you have a question, then you can ask, whether some of the students or participant also write the questions in the comment box. If you still want to ask the question verbally, you can ask. First unmute your mic and then ask the question. Thanks. I think I have to read the questions. This is a question by Anurag Kond. What is the view held the role played by the Bani Israel and the Bnai Menashe Jews regarding the current conflict? And second question is from the Vyas Muni. First question is that, is the failure of OIC that they are divided on the issue Hamas-Israel conflict, or is it because even many of the West Asian countries have realized the importance of the national interests over any other things, like how the rationalist theory of IR sees the world politics? And the second question of the Vyas Muni is that, what's your to take on the absolute gain in world politics is the realist perspective? It is the might when it's come to the cooperation between regional organization or international organizations. Ma'am, now you can give the answer of these questions.
Yeah, so I'll take this question first. Bene Israel. The question is by
Anurag.
Ashutosh?
Anurag.
Anurag. Is Anurag here?
Yes, ma'am.
So, I mean, what is your question? Are you asking about the Jews from India? What is their view?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, so ma'am, as I mentioned about these these Jews who came from Eastern Europe and the Western European, the Sephardic Jews. So, what is the view held by the Indian origin Jews, like the Beni Israeli and the Beni Menashe Jews, these Jews which hail from Northeast India? So, and what has been the role in the current Israeli-Hamas conflict?
Yeah, so see, this is a very small community of Jewish people who went there, right? And when the state of Israel is established, and when these Jews go there to settle down in Israel, most of them who have been able to prove that they originally belong, their origin is Jewish. Quite a few of them are really disillusioned with the state of Israel, right? So I really don't know what is their view about this conflict. But then most of the Sephardi Jews, that is the Jews from the Middle Eastern states, even today, would tell, I have seen some of them speaking on these international news channels like CNN or even BBC, and they are of the view that they should not, Israel should not react in the manner of United States. Because if you see, immediately after 2001, when these attacks happen against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, so the Americans delve into action and they immediately mobilize many forces. There is a lot of anti-Islamist rhetoric that comes from across the world. Countries in the world support them. So this in a way gave them a free hand. And after so many years, now the world knows that this was actually a war which was not necessary, because this led to the occupation of Iraq, not just the occupation of Iraq, but also destruction of cities in Iraq, right? So Israel is also bound to commit such mistakes. So this is the view of mostly the Sephardic Jews, right? And Sephardic Jews who are also citizens of Israel today, they would also feel so. And many of them have families and friends who very closely connected friends in the Islamic world. That is not just the Islamic world, the Arab world, right? So this is their view. I really don't know specifically if the Bene Israelis or Israel.
I want to add a few things. Like I want to, at least I can try for to answer that question, because a few months back I had written a paper on Beni Israelis, as well as the second community has mentioned, whom I and both the communities they migrated from India to Israel, and some of them actually some of the individuals actually they have served in Israel defense forces, and that's how they are in defense forces. Some of them who belongs to Beni Israelis as well as the second community he has mentioned. So in that paper I have written it, and like you mentioned, it was not easy for communities to migrate from India to Israel, and they will accept it easily. That was not so much easy. They faced racism initially. They take some even Israeli authority. They took some time, and after that somehow now they are they have been part of the system. Otherwise, it was difficult in beginning.
Yeah. So regarding Vyas's question on the failure of the OIC. OIC, of course, is an organization of Islamic conference. Is of course a failed organization. Failed organization in the sense that they don't have their specific goal then was OIC when it was established was to protect Muslims across the world, and there should be a solidarity among the Muslims of the world. But then we have seen that the OIC has completely failed even after September 11. They were not able to do much, right? They didn't even oppose the war. In fact, it was most of these countries, most of the OIC countries that had people from these countries who had participated in the strikes against the United States on September 11. But the OIC was unable to present a joint front or have any kind of solidarity. So and of late we have seen that the OIC has not taken up a stance even when it came to genocides of Muslims. For example, in Myanmar, the Rohingyas, the OIC did not take a stand and say that there should be an impartial investigation into this. Except for the United Nations, I don't think any other country has actually stood up for the Muslims or any other group for that matter, right? And regarding the regional organizations, the Arab League of course plays a very important role, but then not such an active role, because the Arab world itself is divided. There is so much of difference because Qatar, which is considered to be the maverick of that region among the Arab states, is also shies away from openly supporting Iran or even Hezbollah, because these guys because they know that given this the way it is being discussed in the world, in the media, that it is a kind of a September 11 for the Israelis, and therefore Israelis have to respond in kind. Israelis have to be prepared. Israelis can actually respond the way they want to. So this is actually something which is dominating the media, not as to how this war should be done or have we learned any lessons from September 11. None of this is being discussed, right? And we all know that emotions are quite high, running high at this time, immediately after the attacks.
Now is this the last question, I think. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the insightful session. Question was is from Diksha Somoni. What is the strategic importance of the conflict in the perspective of India? And second is, how is it going to impact polarization in geopolitics? Also, any long-term conflict resolution steps for the same in your opinions?
What is the strategic importance for India?
We
have seen the Indian response. Right? Immediately after this, after the attack. So immediately after this, the Indian media as well as our Prime Minister, most of these are strategic think tanks, our news media. So they were all of the view that Israel should defeat terrorism. It was, that openly condemn terrorism. Of course, all of us should openly condemn terrorism. There should be no scope for any kind of terrorism. But then, if you only see it from that perspective, that one has to defeat terrorism and therefore any kind of response is fine. If you look from that perspective, then you run the risk of undermining and belittling the sufferings of the Palestinians in the West Bank, not just in the West Bank but also in the Gaza Strip. Not just that, there will obviously be collateral damage, right? if the US cannot avoid collateral damage in cities like Fallujah and others, how do you think that in a densely populated place like the Gaza Strip, that Israelis can actually separate the terrorists from the common people, from the people who are living there? So obviously there is going to be a lot of collateral damage. We already have news that 5,000 people have already been killed in the Gaza Strip. And for a densely populated place like Gaza, 5,000 already killed. And this is all collateral damage. We don't know how many of them are really terrorists, and most of them are women and children. So this has been India's response. However, the Indian Prime Minister Modi also called up the Palestinian president and spoke to him and conveyed his support for the Palestinian people, right? Offering them relief and other helpful measures to tackle this crisis.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. I think Anurag, you also got your point. You also asking about, do you think India can play a role of mediator in the current conflict given New Delhi and relationship with Israel administration? Ma'am has also pointed out your answers. I like to now, is there any question left? I'd like to present a question. Yeah, Soumya Vasu is want to ask ma'am something.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. This was really a great session, and I would like to thank the organizers for also having this important session in these times. And it was really good to see you having a lot of knowledge in the Middle Eastern conflict, as I am also running an organization, and it is very difficult to find scholars in India having the root causes of the Middle Eastern conflict and what's going on today. So I really had some questions I want to ask you, and I would be brief on it. So firstly, in your lecture, you did mention about the religious factor in the religion has been the main factor in this conflict between two states in this in the Israel and Palestine, as well as religion played an important role during the Cold War Middle East as well. But coming to today's conflict, do you think religion has any role? Because as of now, we haven't seen any religious organizations that delivered a statement on this issue. And even Hamas is also like a political organization today, just like Taliban in Afghanistan. So I just wanted to know, would it be right to say that religion even today has a role in this conflict? Because when all we see is this conflict main root lies in the imperialism. This is one question I wanted to ask. So if it is a conflict between two religious states leading to Armageddon, or is it a conflict led by imperialism? And secondly, the question I wanted to ask is, do you consider Israel as you mentioned about the settler violence and settler colonialism. So do you agree that Israel has been an apartheid state of 21st century, and violence you have been mentioning? Do you think that the conventions or the international communities should be more aware, or should declare Israel as an apartheid state and be worried about the genocides?
Okay. So one question is about what is the role of religion in this conflict? See, the religion came into prominence only after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and this was because there was also a major development that happened in Saudi Arabia, which is not as much discussed as the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This was the siege of Mecca. So the siege of Mecca, after the siege of Mecca, the Saudi monarchy also changes its policies, and then that is the reason why they proclaim, or they declare themselves to be the guardians of the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. And after which there is this tension between the regime in Iran, the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran, and the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. What is the tension? The tension is about the Saudis saying that they are promoters of Sunni Islam, and the Shiite regime in Iran saying that they are real revolutionaries and they are bound to take over the entire Middle East. So the Saudis and the UAEs, the Qatar government, the monarchy in Qatar, all of these kingdoms, they were really, frightened with the fact that a similar revolution can also happen in their own states. Because of which, they started aiding the Islamic mullahs, the Maulvis, the religious establishment. So they built up this whole religious establishment, which was like, and that is also the reason why there was so much of support for, because this was also tacitly supported by the United States because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and then because of American policy that, this can be handled. We don't have to go into a direct warfare into Afghanistan, but then this can actually be managed if we start supporting the Islamic networks. And this was entirely supported by Saudi Arabia and all these oil-rich Gulf states, Arab states. And this was in opposition to, in order to challenge Iran. And this is also the time, that is, if you look at the Iran-Iraq war, 80 to 88, everything was quiet. Nobody actually raised this issue, even in the United Nations. And this, one of the reasons was this was because of the Islam, because most of the countries in the world, especially the Islamic countries, countries which are majority of Muslim populations, were really scared of Islamic revolution happening within their respective states. So this is one. Of course, there is a religious angle, but then this has been, especially after the revolution, this has been, hyped up to such an extent that it is almost portrayed as a religious war between different communities. If you look at Arab nationalism, it was a secular Arab nationalism which was led by the Christians of among the Palestinians. George Habash is a Christian. Edward Said is a Christian. There are so many others who are Christians who led the Arab nationalist revolt against the Jewish state of Israel when it was set up. So the Christians leading the Arab nationalist front against the Jewish state of Israel. So I don't think there is, really a religious challenge. Of course, places of worship, Al-Aqsa has become a major flashpoint in the conflict, in the entire conflict. And these are some of the developments that we are seeing off late, right? So I don't think, that can be the only reason, or I don't either feel that, there is an Armageddon coming up. And to your question about settler colonialism, right?
Yes. So regarding the apartheid state, should the theorists consider Israel as the modern apartheid state and genocide?
Yes. Israel, of course, is, if you look at what is happening within the occupied West Bank, in the occupied Palestinian territories, it is, of course, an apartheid. What is an apartheid? South Africa was called as an apartheid state because the South African minority regime, the white minority regime, did not let the blacks, the people of South Africa, have freedom of movement. And there was one set of laws for the blacks living there, the indigenous population in South Africa, and there was one set of laws for the whites, the white minorities living in South Africa. Similar is the case with Israel. So what is the doubt? I don't have any qualms, or I don't have any doubt in saying that Israel, of course, is an apartheid state, right? But then how do we actually fight this apartheid state? The question is, the difference of opinion exists, if at all, is about how to fight the apartheid state. Because South Africa, when it was an apartheid state, was sanctioned by the international community of states. All the Western European states sanctioned South Africa. There was no other country, even Indian government had sanctioned South Africa. The countries of the world were unwilling to do business with South Africa. That is not the case with Israel, because this is much more, the whole issue of what we call as anti-Semitism, right? See, you can sanction a state, you can sanction a regime, but you cannot sanction a group of people, right? Just because you are subjecting South Africa to sanction, you are subjecting the South African government to sanctions, doesn't mean that you will start sanctioning or you will start boycotting Jews all over the world. So that will lead us to a very different situation, right? And this is what eventually leads to the rise of other ideologies, which becomes even much more difficult to tackle. So that is a problem, right? Of course, there is apartheid in Israel, given by going by what are the conditions on the ground. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And this is the last question. I think we have to complete the session. Uh, is this the conflict going to aggravate polarization in the geopolitics? It's asked by the Diksha Moni Tamuli. Is the conflict going to aggravate polarization in the geopolitics?
Aggravate. See, the lines are clear. The lines which have been drawn, dividing the world into two blocks. That is, there is one block which is, we had the Chinese very recently who said that they had a deal. They have persuaded the Iranians and the Saudis to make a deal, right? So this was very recently in the news. But we don't see any of them speak up for the Palestinians or for anyone else there, right? Except for vetoing some resolutions. Otherwise, no other party except the United States has such an active role in the region. We see only the United States playing such an active role in terms of ensuring that there is the ground invasion is delayed in order to convince Israel that they should go in for. This is not the way they handle the issue. Or the Hamas is also aware of this fact. The very reason that they let go of the two hostages, the American hostages, mother and daughter, on the day when Biden had visited, itself shows that even the other organizations are well aware of this fact. That if at all there is a major player in the region, it has to be the United States. None of the others are speaking up. Neither for the Hamas, nor for the Israelis. They are only saying that Israel has the right to use force. That is all that they are saying. So it's very clearly drawn. And then the other important thing that we'll have to note is that the Iranians are so restrained. Hezbollah is so very restrained, right? Despite Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, they are so very restrained. They don't want to exacerbate the situation, right? So we have quite a lot of players quite restrained in their dealings after this conflict.
I'm really sorry, I missed the two questions in the chat box. I'm really sorry for that. That was a really important question in the perspective of Israel-Hamas conflict. First question is from Sharim Mista. Analyzing the present situation, can we say peace is a myth in West Asia?
What is it?
She asked,
what
analyzing the present situation, can we say peace is a myth in West Asia? Myth in a West Asia.
Okay. See, peace was of course achievable in 1993 when they signed the Oslo Accords. Peace was of course offered in so many other accords, the Taba Accord. There were so many numerous rounds of negotiations that happened between the Palestinians, that happened between the State of Israel, with the active participation of the Arab states, with the active participation of the European Union, with the active participation of the United States, with the Norwegians. So peace was of course achievable. What actually we have to defeat now is this sentiment for anti-peace, right? Because the state actors have become so very powerful in this scenario that all of these states have their own respective national interest, which they call as a national interest. And that is what is actually a serious setback to the peace efforts. Because we can see that most of these states want some kind of an acceptance from Israel, not just an acceptance, they are willing to recognize the State of Israel and accept the State of Israel, not just that. There are also talks ongoing for that software that Israelis had, even the state of Indian government had used against spy software, right? So these are some of the, of course, technological cooperation is with Israel, which all of these countries want. Some of these surveillance equipments for surveillance, these are some of the ongoing talks which the states really care more about than actually getting or than having peace on the ground or peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So Palestinians have become, nobody actually considers them to be really partners who can play such an active role that they can convince the other states to act on their behalf. Now it's like, it's going the other way. The Palestinians have become the pawn and then the others are the serious actors, right? So they will, they have negotiations amongst themselves. The states Israelis with the Arab states, Israelis with the other regimes, they would have their own arrangements. And the Palestinian issue is, it's just a side talk amongst whatever is happening about peace.